Good morning, everyone. It is March 23rd. I'm going to go over some news coming out of Ukraine and Russia, as well as show you a map at the end of the video and talk a bit about what's going on the battlefield. So over the last 48 hours, Russian forces have conducted limited drone and missile strikes across Ukraine. They're actually down about 80% from previous missile strike rates over the past few months, which is indicating that Russia is struggling with a precision missile shortage. Interestingly, Ukraine shot down 16 of the drones that were used by Russian forces. Moving on, Sergei Shoigu has announced that Russia intends to increase the size of their air defense forces. He announced previously the ground defense increases sometime mid last year. He's indicated that he wants to increase the operational tactical army aviation by 90%, the strategic long-range aviation by 60%, and UAV operators by 85%. The Russian military is unlikely to be able to generate any new air defense or airlift units within the next few years, if not several years, let alone by the end of 2023. This won't even affect the war, quite frankly, unless we see this war become a multi-decade situation. The formation of these new units likely is more focused on reassuring the Kremlin, reassuring the Russian people that the Russian Ministry of Defense is continuing to develop the Russian military rather than just throwing stuff at Ukraine. They also have ambitions to be a world-class military power still. Sergei Shoigu also signaled to Japan that it should not attempt to exploit Russia's current military vulnerability in the Kuril Islands, and also signaled to China that Russia remains a worthwhile military partner despite the terrible damage Ukraine has inflicted on the Russian military. So even though there was a meeting between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, it seems that Russia is still concerned about China's willingness to be on board with Russia as a military partner, which I would be worried too, because China has essentially agreed to nothing in the military realm with regard to Russia and their integration. They do some drills together, but they don't have any formal treaties. They don't even have any kind of military operational trade going on since the war. And obviously with Japan being very Western aligned and this dispute over the Kuril Islands with Russia, they're concerned that Japan, who has a quite powerful navy and a quite powerful military in general, could easily take them. And I agree, they could easily take them. But again, Sergei Shoigu signaling to Japan that they should not attempt to do so. After these discussions, Sergei Shoigu refused to answer questions about how soon he expected peace in Ukraine and just walked away. Obviously, he has no idea. Interestingly, Russia is in control of when peace could be maintained rapidly if they just left. And they're trying to set the information conditions and prepare the Russian population for what is going to probably be a multi-year protracted war effort in Ukraine. Even if Ukraine were to eject the Russians out, Russia would likely be a belligerent problem for Ukraine for the long term. The tempo of Russian operations around Bakhmut appears to be slowing down. I'll show you a bit of map stuff at the end, but Russian forces are increasing their tempo of operations in another area that I'll talk about in Avdiivka, aiming to encircle this settlement, and probably doing so at the expense of their operations around Bakhmut and the stalled offensives near Volodar, which there hasn't really been anything taking place near Volodar at all. Russian authorities are secretly monitoring and raiding Russian bars in urban areas, possibly to crack down on internal dissent amongst Russian social circles. These raids are targeting rich Russian bars and lounges, not necessarily those of the poorer, more rural or working class, but really upscale bars where rich businessmen are discussing the poor outcomes of the war, where they're at currently. On the mobilization front, the Kremlin continues to conduct a hybrid reserve call-up. This is something that takes place every year. This was planned. It happens regardless of whether Russia's in war or not. The problem is a lot of those that are being called up are resisting service, knowing that they likely will end up on the front line in Ukraine. In order to combat this, the Kremlin is shortening reservist time frames for how long they need to be in service. but at the same time are also shortening the required amount of training for these contract servicemen and these new reservists. They're also conducting their crypto mobilization, which is kind of a secret mobilization where they're bringing in additional soldiers. There's no word on how many soldiers they've actually mobilized at this point because no one's even reporting on this. We just keep continuing to hear word of soldiers of military age males getting pulled into the Russian military under a conscription status without any kind of warning. Within the occupied territories of places like Kherson and Luhansk, they're planning on conscripting the entire military age male population for fighting in the war. So I don't know how that's going to go over. In Kherson, the volunteer battalion that is attempted to be formed by the occupation administration had essentially 1 to 2 volunteers show up, and the battalion is likely to be used for internal security rather than going to the front line. From a legislative standpoint, the Russian officials and occupation authorities continue to try to change the laws in Russia to benefit them with regard to kidnapping children. The changes are aimed at reconfiguring the status of children that are taken from their homes so long as they are wounded in the special military operation, which leads me to believe that, as terrible as Russia is, the new low for them likely will be intentionally wounding children in order to justify taking them from Ukraine into Russia. And that's where we're at. Here's the map of the battlefield. So just quickly, once over on what's going on the map here, we have Bakhmut up here, we have Avivka here, we have Sevastopol and Odessa, and then some fighting taking place along the banks of the Dnieper River right in here. So I'll go ahead and zoom in first on Bakhmut and talk about what's going on over here, because this is where the main fighting is taking place. Russian forces continue to conduct offensive operations in the area, but Ukrainian forces have repelled multiple assaults both in southern Bakhmut and in northern Bakhmut in order to free up this highway, or free up pressure, not that it's under Russian control, but this is the H-32 highway. In order to maintain control of it, to allow for more supplies to come into Bakhmut, the Ukrainians are actually conducting counteroffensives to the southwest and southeast in this area here. Southwest and northwest of the city of Bakhmut, so that they can relieve some of the pressure from artillery and potentially Russians overrunning this H-32 highway, which is the main artery into Bakhmut. Russians still haven't taken it. However, the Ukrainians want to try to drive them further back to free up the logistics lines' ability to move into Bakhmut. Moving on, coming out to Avivka, moving to the south here. This will be probably the next town, although it's not as large as Bakhmut, that we discuss, as this is where Russia is trying to conduct enveloping operations. You can kind of already see it shaping out here, where they're trying to connect these two nodes by using essentially the exact same tactics they've used over and over again and failed. And this will be the next potential area. Russia has made some gains, specifically in this area right here, and moving more towards the west here, but this is where a bulk of Russian attacks outside of Bakhmut are taking place, and they have gained small amounts of ground. The Ukrainians don't have as many forces in this region, but it is far less tactically significant than Bakhmut. All right, zooming out, we'll go head over to the Dnieper River area. The Dnieper River is where you can see a lot of the Ukrainian forces are actually operating on the east bank. So Russian lines sit in this area, and then through here, essentially the assumed counteroffensive will come through this region downward to sweep and try to cut off and link up with this body of water and cut off Crimea from logistics, and then from the south try to destroy the Kerch Bridge again. But currently there's Ukrainian forces operating on the east side of the Dnieper River, conducting limited attacks, mostly probably probing attacks, trying to clear various obstacles, continue to do any kind of what they would call clearing operations on the east bank of this river. And then finally, with regard to some of the missile attacks, as we zoom out, we see Odessa and Sevastopol here. This is significant because obviously Sevastopol is in Crimea. So the Ukrainian forces conducted some drone attacks on occupied Sevastopol. The Russians say that their air defenses intercepted several, but some of them actually hit their targets. In response, the Russians determined that these drones likely originated out of Odessa, and the Russian forces struck airfields in Odessa on March 21st.